Welcome to Canadian Justice. I'm Christine Van Gyn, and today we're talking about criminal law cases where the accused is found not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. This was the verdict just handed down in a tragic case from Toronto. The facts of the case are horrifying and will likely be disturbing to most viewers. On June 17th, 2022, Tenzin Norbu entered a bus in Toronto where he approached Naima Dolma, a young nurse who was sitting at the back. The two were strangers, but Norbu suffered from untreated schizophrenia, which had been misdiagnosed. Norbu, who is Tibetan, was allegedly suffering from paranoid delusions about threats from other Tibetan people. When Norbu entered the bus, he asked Dolma if she was Tibetan. She replied that she was, and a few minutes later, Norbu dumped a mason jar of lighter fluid on her shirt and lit it, setting her on fire. She ran from the bus, and while more than 50 people were present on the platform, only a few came to her help. She died 18 days later from her injuries. Norbu was charged with first-degree murder but pleaded not guilty. Both the Crown and the defense agreed that Norbu should be found not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. The court agreed, finding that Norbu suffering from schizophrenia that made him incapable of appreciating his act was wrong. Norbu will now appear at a hearing before the Ontario Review Board, which will determine the hospital where he will be held. Here today to discuss this case and the law around findings of not criminally responsible are two criminal lawyers, Joseph Neuberger and Kabir Sharma. Thank you both so much for joining me today. Kabir, let me start with you. One of the things that stood out to me so much in this case was that both the Crown and the defense agreed that Norbu was not criminally responsible. How unusual do you think that is?
In my experience, Christine, it's not that unusual. It really depends on the reports that are authored by the forensic psychiatrists that do the analysis of the individual. Oftentimes, we have to remember that the Crown not only has a duty to the public, but also has a duty to the accused person. So if a report outlines specifically that that person was suffering from issues that would lead to a not criminally responsible verdict, then they're obligated at times to join the defense and presenting that to the judge.
Joseph, what do you think? Do you think that this was a clear-cut case of not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder, and that's what maybe led to this agreement by both the Crown and the defense?
Yeah, there seemed to have been a robust history of mental illness and documented treatment where he was misdiagnosed with depression and other issues. But there was a long history of a psychotic disorder rooted in a number of themes. So there was a lot of information for the assessing psychiatrist to look at and then provide the opinion on.
So, Joseph, what kind of things does an accused person need to demonstrate in order to make out this defense of not criminally responsible? You've mentioned the forensic psychologist, but what other things might they need?
So typically, the most important aspect is that there is some external evidence that can be relied upon that an assessor can look at to determine if there is, what the diagnosis is and what the condition is. And there will also be outward behaviors that will be obvious to a number of onlookers. So critically, you have to have a forensic psychiatrist, and usually there's a team. There's a social worker involved, a psychologist. They'll gather up medical records if they're available, other assessments, and look at that material. And then there's going to be in-depth assessments and interviews with the individual who's charged. So typically there's an in custody assessment. So they will be transferred to a mental health facility where they're observed and they undergo all these assessments. And at the end of the day, experienced clinicians will arrive at a conclusion. So in this case, as we've mentioned, there was a long-standing history where the particular doctor found he might have been suffering for about 10 or 20 years. So when you have all that information, that's sufficient for a report and an opinion on NCR.
Now, Kabir, we've mentioned a few of the facts on the ground or the background of this long history. The forensic psychiatrist. I mean, the act itself of what happened just sort of kind of speaks to mental illness. Is there? We've only got about 30 seconds. Is there any other fact that stood out to you that would have been helpful in having the court reach this conclusion?
I think in this case, there were a lot of other individuals who were able to observe the behavior on the bus. So the psychiatrist was able to have a sufficient amount of evidence to make the determination, like how Joseph said, independently. You heard what he said, what he did afterwards,
Hmm.
and the way he was acting in general, which I
Yeah.
think in these circumstances was very helpful.
We've got to go to break, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what it means to be found not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. Now, Kabir, why does our system work this way? Why do we treat defendants differently when they have a mental disorder? Why does this defense even exist?
In our justice system, we only find people guilty and convict individuals that commit acts intentionally. What the law has decided is that some individuals, when they're not committing an act intentionally because they are under some mental illness or some other issue, that those people should not be held responsible because they didn't do it intentionally. They weren't thinking logically, they weren't thinking rationally, and as a result, it's a bit of an in between from guilty and not guilty that they're not criminally responsible. And that's why we have this verdict.
Joseph, is there anything you want to add to that? I know a lot of our viewers might be familiar with the legal terms mens res and actus reus. Does mental illness fit into the mens rea part of that distinction? Maybe you can explain what that is.
Yeah, it's exactly what Kabir was saying. So you have to have the mental intent to commit an offense. So for first degree murder, specific to kill an individual, and then planning and deliberation. What happens with a mental illness is an individual is robbed of their ability to appreciate the nature and quality of their acts or the moral and legal wrongfulness of it. So they're robbed of that mental element. And that's because of their delusional or psychotic disorder. So we don't convict people who are mentally ill. We deal with them in a different way. Although they committed the act, the mental element is not present because of the pervasive illness.
Now, I know there's some people who are watching this who have heard the argument before, and maybe they've made it. They say people plead insanity. They plead the insanity defense, which is what sometimes people call this not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder, and they view that as a get out of jail free card. Joseph, they say you argue this and you can get away with murder. Basically, what's your response to that argument that some people make?
Yeah, so I think it's very important that the public understands that this is not a get out of jail free, and it we can't get mixed up with the United States. There's no such thing as temporary insanity. What it is an NCR based upon a cogent foundation of evidence that somebody was mentally ill. And as a result of that, the individual will wind up going to a mental health facility. I sat on the Ontario Review Board for 19 years as a lawyer and an alt chairperson. So what happens is they will then go to a locked facility, a secure facility, where they are in a room. We treat them not properly as we should any person who's not well or even convicted of an offense, and they will be involved in continuous assessments and treatment modalities including medication and vocational training as well as psychological and a battery of other things, but they have their privileges significantly restricted. On a case like this, a person will wind up in a medium to maximum secure facility where they remain in their range or their area for a long period of time. They will be gradually granted privileges, but they won't get access to the community for a long, long time. And they
Yeah,
have to respond to medication.
Joseph, let me ask you about that process. So now that he's been found not criminally responsible, he goes to the Ontario Review Board, which, as you said, you sit on. And what do they look at when deciding where they're going to send him? What privileges he might get? What factors are they considering when
Okay.
reaching those decisions?
Okay, so I used to sit on it for 19 years. I don't now. But what will happen is there will be a report prepared. It'll go to the panel. There's lawyers who represent the hospital, lawyer who represents the Crown and the individual. And what's key factors is to take a look at the offending behavior, to take a look at the history of illness, how long it's been ingrained, treatment, what are their treatment prospects, and really what we're looking at or what they would look at is risk profile. So what's their level of risk at this time? And typically this is early stages where somebody may be receiving treatment at the jail, but it's very early stages. There's extensive assessment and treatment that's necessary. So the risk profile for this individual will be fairly significant. So they will wind up being transferred to somewhere like CAMH or Ontario Shores or somewhere else in a medium secure facility.
And can you we've only got 45 seconds left, but what are those facilities like?
Well, they're very similar to jails in the sense that there's locked areas. There's other areas which are minimum units. They use different language now, but there's minimum units where there's much more access to the grounds and the hospital. They're very pleasant facilities. Some are more modernized than others, and they have lots of activities, vocational training, recreational access to grounds. They're pleasant facilities, but that doesn't mean the incident itself is not treated seriously. It is, but we're dealing with somebody who's
Hmm.
mentally ill, not somebody who intentionally wanted to kill an individual, but did it
Right.
because of a delusional system.
We've got to go to break now, but we'll be right back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what it means to be found not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder, and a horrific case out of Toronto involving a man who randomly attacked a stranger on the bus, killing her by setting her on fire. Now, there have been a number of other high profile cases, Kabir, where defendants have argued the defense that they are not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. I'm thinking in particular of the case of Alec Minassian, a young man with autism who ran down strangers in a van, killing them in 2018. But Minassian's claim was unsuccessful. So, what do you think the difference was in his case versus Norbu's case, where he was found not criminally responsible?
So I think it's important to note, Christine, that it's not any mental illness that can form a sufficient basis to provide an NCR verdict. What needs to happen is your ability to appreciate the acts that you're engaging in and your ability to think rationally about what's happening is affected by that mental illness. In this case, even though there was some claim that autism may have led to the actions that he ultimately resulted in the deaths of 10 people, it wasn't something that Mr. Manassian didn't appreciate or understand that he was doing. And as a result of that, that's why his claim was unsuccessful. That's much different than the issue that we have here, where somebody was found to be suffering from schizophrenia and had delusions over an extended period of time. And I think that is the difference, and that's what the public needs to know and understand when it comes to NCRs.
Now, Joseph, there was another very famous case that viewers may be familiar with involving a man named Vince Lee. And he was famously the Greyhound bus killer. He beheaded a stranger, another passenger on a Greyhound bus. And he was also found not criminally responsible. This was many years ago. He has now been given an absolute discharge. So, can you tell us what happened in his case and perhaps what led to the finding of not criminal responsible in that case?
Yeah, I remember the case, and I know well the forensic psychiatrist who did the assessment. So Mr. Lee was also suffering from a pervasive mental disorder that resulted in delusions and psychosis, and he had been untreated. Once he was in custody and then transferred to the mental health facility, he underwent appropriate assessment and treatment, and the pharmacological treatment worked very well. He responded in a very robust manner to the medication, such that his delusional disorder uh, was abated. And so he was essentially in remission. So his risk profile came down significantly. It's just like if unfortunately you have diabetes, with untreated, you're at high risk. But if you're treated and everything is controlled well, then you're going to be healthy. It's the exact same with mental illness of this nature. Schizophrenia is treatable, some are not, some are more treatment resistant. But in his case, he responded extremely well to medication and had great insight into what he did and was involved in his own relapse prevention, etc. So his profile came down significantly because of successful treatment.
So I think people watching might wonder how that could apply to this case involving Norbu, who also experienced paranoid delusions and schizophrenia. And I mean, people watching might be concerned about, when he is released, what he has to prove to get released, and if he is able to manage an illness with medication, what obligations are on him once he's out to continue with that medication program, and what safeguards are in place to ensure that he's still taking medication and keeping his psychosis under control, Joseph?
Okay, so there's a large, sort of ladder or cascading process as to how somebody gets to the community. So once they're being treated and they're responding well, they'll gradually get access to the community, and that will be under what's called a detention order. So they'll be in hospital, but eventually they'll have passes to the community, an hour, half an hour, and then it starts to extend it more and more. Eventually, under a detention order, they can be placed in a home in the community where they have supervision and they become more autonomous in medication compliance, and they'll take it. And then over the course of time, they'll start to show more and more independence. This all depends upon their own insight and ability to take care of their own health issues. And there's relapse prevention, risk prevention plans. There's a team set up once they move to the community. There's a forensic outpatient program. And then eventually, if they are discharged, they can be moved to a non forensic team, community based, which will then provide additional supports and supervision. And some patients do extremely well over time and wind up becoming completely autonomous with their own treatment and medication and don't pose a risk. And that happens quite often. And fortunately, the recidivism rate with this population is extremely low.
Wow, that's interesting to hear. That's a data point I'd never heard before about recidivism when it comes to mental illness. We've got to go to commercial break now, but we will continue this conversation when we come back. Welcome back to Canadian Justice, where we're discussing what it means to be found not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder. Now, Kabir, these cases, the ones that we've been talking about involving Norbu, involving the Greyhound killer, um, involving Alec Manassian, where these claims of not criminally responsible have been made. These are horrible cases that really stick in our memory because they all involved assaults on complete strangers, which is, I think, for many of us, the nightmare scenario. It's why a lot of us are afraid to ride the subway in Toronto. But how often do you actually see defenses of not criminally responsible, and how often do you see successful defenses of not criminally responsible for reason of mental disorder?
So, in my experience, it's a very significant decision to even bring a defense of not criminally responsible. It's not something that you do or raise with the court or with anybody else unless you're almost certain that you're going to be going in that direction. And that's because the process changes entirely. So, typically, when that defense is brought, there is a strong and solid foundation to be bringing that defense. You require all the evidence that you need, and there is a legal hearing over it. And sometimes the Crown Attorney does not agree. Sometimes the Crown is the individual saying, or the body saying, that the person is not criminally responsible, and the defense is saying no. So it really depends specifically on each case. Now, when it's successful, it really depends on the type of evidence that is gathered by both parties and the types of reviews that are done by the psychiatrist. Sometimes you need to convince a judge, sometimes you need to convince a jury. And it all really depends on the individual circumstances of the case. However, it's not something that any lawyer would bring lightly and not something that's just brought willy nilly in the hopes that it'll get your client off some minor charge.
Joseph, anything you want to add there about how often we see successful defenses of not criminally responsible?
I think what's important to note is that mental illness is prevalent in society. And a hallmark of a functional democracy and a civil society is that we don't treat people who are mentally ill like criminals. And we have to have regard for the fact that they didn't want to be suffering from schizophrenia or delusional disorder. And so we have to deal with them in a different manner. These high profile cases are extremely tragic and extremely grim,
Yeah,
but
and
there's
I think
many
we
other.
want to also emphasize the trauma that the victim in this case, in particular, well,
Oh,
actually, in all of these cases we're discussing, endured. I mean, the
oh,
it's
it's horrible.
nightmarish.
This is absolute horror what happened to this young lady, and in many other cases where there's homicides, the lasting trauma to the family. I mean, this is very, very significant. It's life altering for the family. But that being said, it's a mental illness and it's very prevalent. And there are many people who are accused of criminal offenses who are found NCR for much lower types of cases that the public would never hear about because there's this pervasiveness of mental illness. And that's why I think it's very important for us to invest in treating mental illness at the early stages and investing in the civil side of this. So if people are not well, they have to be able to get access to assessments and to treatment. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done on that side so that it doesn't reach the level of the tragedy that we have in this case.
Yeah, Kabir, about a minute. Anything to add there? I think it's important to know that Norbu was misdiagnosed in this case and may have had these delusions for as long as 20 years.
And see, that's a big issue in this case. And I think that's something that may contribute ultimately to his ability to rehabilitate himself. Because if he was being provided the wrong medication for an extended period of time and misdiagnosed, if being provided the right medication, he might respond to it very well and might end up living life as a productive and quote unquote normal member of society. So it's unfortunate that happens, but it does happen, quite often. And we have to remember that a lot of people that get in trouble with the criminal justice system suffer from some type of mental
Mhm.
health issue. And like Joseph said, it's important to be able to address those issues and those people
Right.
in the right way.
That's all the time we have. Thank you both so much for sharing your expertise. We've heard today about the tragic case of a young woman who was murdered by a total stranger while he was suffering from mental illness. What's your take on the defense of not criminally responsible by reason of mental disorder? How do we ensure people who are severely mentally ill receive treatment so they are not a danger to themselves and others? What roles do courts, prisons, and mental health facilities have once a terrible crime like this has been committed? You be the judge. Thanks for watching, and remember, a freer Canada starts with you.